Hello and welcome to our Success Tips and Helpful Hints series. This is a second in our series, and it deals with researching and writing decisions. This was developed by the Independent Hearing Officer Work Group and sponsored by the Council of State Administrators of Vocational Rehabilitation. With all that said, let's get started with some success tips that may help you in your hearings and researching and writing decisions. So obviously the first step when you've had the hearing is to research the decision. And one of the most important issues that we find in writing decisions is to clearly refer to the issue established by the parties as the basis for the hearing. Like every building needs a foundation, every hearing decision needs a foundational issue. Now there may be more than one issue, certainly, but clarifying those and codifying those is very important in presenting a coherent decision. In a related note, making sure the record is closed and all the evidence is in may be tempting before all the record is closed to research a piece of legislation or research a piece of guidance put out at some point. And then lo and behold, a piece of evidence comes in that changes the direction or changes sort of the fundamental nature of the decision and how it develops. So as a best practice, it's important to make sure that you have all the evidence, the record's closed, and you have the evidence in front of you, and it's organized, right? So you want to organize and review your hearing notes, your transcripts, your exhibits. Certainly, if you have recordings of the hearing, it's helpful to have those with you as you research. We found that you may be in the middle of researching and think, what was the testimony here? What was the evidence that was presented there? It's very helpful to be able to quickly and efficiently go back to that so that you can make your research more efficient. And finally, review and give weight to the evidence presented, whether that's testimony, whether that is evidence that is presented in the form of guidance, whether that's evidence that's been presented in the form of documentation. You want to review and decide, how much relative weight is each piece going to receive, because you're going to want to be able to refer to that later in your decision in order to provide the clearest decision you can. Next steps, reviewing legal sources cited by the parties during the hearing and in briefs. Legal sources are all often presented by opposing sides. There may be guidance presented. There may be codes of federal law presented. So the legal sources, there may be precedent, for example, presented. So the legal sources are going to be important to review and codify. Knowing the applicable regulations, sub-regulatory guidance, agency and states' pertinent administrative rules. A best practice, for example, is to request the manual, the policy and procedures manual for the particular agency that was in effect at the time the services were delivered, at the time at issue. And that way you have the state's pertinent administrative rules, policies, procedures in front of you. Know where to find the sub-regulatory guidance, the guidance put out by the Fed, for example. Know where to find sort of the agency's guidelines, know where to find the regulations, know the applicable laws. Very, very important pieces. And then, of course, related to requesting the policies and procedures, be aware of the agency's policies and procedures. Have a copy of that manual that you can then refer to and go back to and say, oh, and in policy, in section 2, this is what's referred to. Very important to be able to tie a decision back to appropriate policy and procedure. What are the key legal sources? Well, certainly there's the Workforce Investment Opportunity Act, or WIOA. Many of us are familiar with that. The Code of Federal Regulations at 34 CFR 361. Really important to know that that's sort of the pool of federal regulations from which you're pulling for these kinds of decisions. RSA sub-regulatory guidance. As we mentioned, guidance is put out occasionally by RSA. Oftentimes they were on green sheets. You'll hear them referred to as green sheets from time to time. Important to know what's current and what's out there in terms of sub-regulatory guidance. And finally, previously mentioned agency and state sources. If you've got state law that you're that you may be basing a decision on, or maybe an issue in the case, have that in front of you and have that codified. If you've got policy and procedures we've mentioned, have that in front of you and have that codified. These are all the sort of the key sources on which you're going to base your, if you can think of the issues as the foundation, and then the sill plate of the house as the key legal sources. These are the foundations on which you're going to build your decision. And so you've got to have a solid issue, and you've got to have a solid sill plate. You've got to have solid pillars on which to build a functional house, on which to writing the decision. So now we're in a position where we've done the research. We think we've gotten all the policy, procedure, administrative, legal guidance we can. We've got sub-regulatory guidance. We think we're in a position. We've kind of formulated things. We're in a position to write that now. What should be in there? Well, certainly the issues to be decided as agreed to by the parties, right? That foundation of the house that we're building here. The finding of facts, think of those as the walls of the house that you're going to build. What do you find that were findings of fact? What happened? The conclusions of law, think of that as sort of the roof of the house that you're building, right? What did the sub-regulatory guidance, what direction did that lead you? What did the CFR lead you? Where did the policies or procedures leave you? And finally, the kind of the interior dressings, the windows, the paint, is the decision itself, right? Those are the things that are going to be most visible. It's going to be the decision. And of course, like a house, if you don't have a solid foundation in issues, finding of facts, conclusion of law, that decision's not going to look very good probably, and it's probably not going to hold up. So again, you want to be clear and intentional in building a solid foundation, a solid sill plate, solid walls, solid roof, and then of course making your decision, the paint, the windows, how do you get into the house? You want to make that very clear, intuitive, and easy to understand. Here's some considerations. Keep in mind the constituency to whom and for whom the decision is being written. The one thing you want to keep in mind is reading levels vary, and you want to be as clear as you can be, as professional as you can be, but you want to avoid jargon. You want to avoid lots and lots of acronyms that people aren't necessarily going to be able to understand. If you are tempted to use an acronym, we'd encourage you use the full words that are associated with that acronym. Be clear. Be mindful of grammar. Be mindful of things like typos. Short's better than long. If you've ever read a novel and finished and thought, man, I couldn't put that down, the chances are good that what you were reading were short, clear, powerful paragraphs that weren't very long and wordy. Long and wordy is tempting in a decision like this because you tend to be thinking as you're writing. What I would encourage you to do is think as you write a draft, and then see if you can cut that to half the words. What you'll find a lot of times is that in order to do that, you need to be clearer, and when you're clearer, you're more effective. Practicability versus scholarship. Again, this is the kind of that same issue of we can write flowery, long, smart-sounding stuff, but is it usable? Is somebody going to be able to understand it? Similar to our house analogy, right? If we could get all kinds of fancy and put in angled entrances and all that kind of stuff, but is the house going to live right? Are you going to be able to find the front door? Are you going to be able to walk in? Are you going to be able to, is it going to be fun to live there? That's an analogy to a metaphor to be thinking about when you're building a decision. How usable is this decision? How understandable is it? Repetition versus non-repetition. There's a certain amount of repetition that goes into writing decisions. We know that. But when you find that repetition, it's okay to say, as referred to in section so-and-so. And so that, if people don't get sort of so bogged down in reading the same thing all the time that they start to wonder what you were thinking, right? You want to be clear. If you have to have repetition, you want to be clear that you're acknowledging the repetition, but this repetition relates to a separate piece or a separate issue. Sentences, short versus long, simple versus complex. Short is always better, simple is always better. I know it's tempting to write long and flowery sentences. I do the same thing. Many of us do. But short is better. Short is usable. Short is practical. Short is understandable. Long tends not to be. And then language, simple language versus legalese. Try to avoid the legalese if you can. I know that it's tempting because you're reading a bunch of legalese, but part of our role as independent hearing officers is being able to translate that information so that it's practical, so that it's usable, so that people can follow this decision. People can, look at that house and actually use that house, get in and out of it effectively, those kinds of things. Findings of fact, an important piece here. Covers the weight given to various items of evidence presented. So if there's a fact that's not really all that relevant to the case, it probably doesn't belong in the decision. However, if there's a fact that's clearly relevant to the case and you want to be very clear about this was an important piece, talk about that. Talk about that as a finding of fact. I find that the consumer in this case did request on so-and-so, whatever the issue may be. I find that the agency, in fact, did provide X, Y, or Z. That's a finding of fact. And if it's weighty and it applies to the decision, it should be in the findings of fact section. Be sure to include all findings necessary to resolve issues raised by the evidence and relevant to the decision. Kind of like we've been talking about, right? If it's relevant to your decision, it should be in the findings of fact section. We should be able to read that decision, read the findings of fact, and say, okay, it's clear to what this hearing officer is referring, and it's clear the weight that they gave to these different pieces. That's an important piece of sort of building that house that's functional and usable. The parameters. Burden of proof lies with the consumer, except in the case of presumption of eligibility. Important to remember that. So, and a burden of proof simply is kind of what it sounds like, right? So if a consumer brings a case and it doesn't have to do with presumption of eligibility, the consumer has to prove that they were wronged in the case and has to establish that. The burden of proof, the burden of bringing that evidence is on the consumer. The exception, of course, is presumption of eligibility. So if there's a presumption of eligibility case, the burden of proof shifts to the agency. It's very important to remember that. And it's on the agency then to bring the evidence, bring the proof that presumption of eligibility was met appropriately. Content of testimony and exhibits should support your decision. Again, you should be able to read through and say, what were the findings of facts? What were the key pieces of testimony? What were the exhibits relied upon? All of that should build. That should be, again, part of the foundation that builds to this house that you're presenting as the final decision. Important to ensure that you see that there's a clear record of the hearing, both in getting the facts out and such mundane tasks as ensuring a full recording of the hearing. What does that mean? Well, we can do some things as hearing officers to ensure that there's a clear record. And a couple of those things are, drawing the facts out of folks in testimony, for example, clarifying things when we're within the hearing, clarifying the weight that we're giving to certain findings of fact, the weight that we're giving to the conclusions of law, and ensuring that we have a full and complete recording of the hearing in the event that there's a challenge to the decision, in the event that somebody wants to say, wait, I need to see how this house was built. I need to see the raw materials and the lumber that went into this house. Well, that's what a full recording of the hearing does. And we, as hearing officers, can take steps to ensure that happens. We only render decisions on issues established by the parties. We're not here to decide alternate issues. We are simply here to decide on the issues that are at issue and as identified by the parties. Very important to know that we step outside of our scope when we begin to develop issues that weren't clearly established by the parties. And in part one, you saw that there are some best practices around clarifying those issues, and they're best done before the hearing even begins. But being clear that when we're writing decisions, we're established and we're focused clearly on the issues established by the parties. Decision must be based solely on the evidence submitted at the hearing. It can't be based on assumptions that were made outside of the hearing. It can't be based on something somebody said outside of the hearing, right? It has to be based on things that happened in the hearing. And we weigh the evidence based on factors such as authenticity and credibility. That's part of the hearing officer's job, is to decide, is this statement credible? Is this evidence authentic? Is it credible? Is it trustworthy? That sort of thing. Findings of fact, very important piece, right, of building the house. This is, again, a big part of, how stable is this house that we're building. Should be consistent with each other as well as conclusions of law and decision. So, if you have a finding of fact that's somewhat inconsistent with some others, you have some work to do in writing the decision to say, here's why I've given weight to this fact, and it may or may not be consistent with the other facts, but here's why I feel that I've given it significant weight. Certainly, consistency with other facts is the best evidence, right, that a finding of fact is appropriate. But if you have a finding of fact that's inconsistent, you need to decide, well, is that truly foundational? Is that truly relevant here? Is that something that I want to talk about? Because a finding of fact that's inconsistent with other facts tends to kind of put the stability of that house at risk a little bit. You have to decide, is it foundational? Is that worth it? And you have to explain how that happens. Remember, decisions are subject to reversal where findings are insufficient or the IHO failed to include a finding on a crucial issue. Very important to remember, if you, let's say that it's very clear in your mind, because that can happen when you're writing a decision. You could be very clear that the facts are 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And let's say that you're writing the decision and you list finding of fact 1 and 2 and 3, and you're thinking, that's good enough. Well, maybe not. It might be good enough for you right this second, but you're better off listing all of the findings of fact. Let's say you left one out that was crucial to one of the issues at issue at the hearing. That leaves your decision subject to reversal on appeal. So it's a very important that you list all of the findings of fact, that you talk about the weight that you've given them, that you resolve any inconsistencies with findings of fact, and that you lay a solid foundation. And again, consistency is the most solid foundation that you can lay within that scope. Should share the reasoning employed in reaching conclusions of law. Very important to remember that conclusions of law are developed based on your understanding of what you're seeing, based on your understanding of the CFR, of the regulatory guidance, of policy and procedure. So you are making decisions, and we need to be clear when we're describing those decisions, our reasoning behind them. So it's a very important piece. If somebody comes and follows and looks at our hearing and says the transcript or our decision and says, well, I'm not even sure how this person made this decision, it's likely going to be reversed. So you should be able to, by the time you get down to the final decision and you've gone through findings of fact and conclusion of law, it should be very clear what your decision is going to be, is what that decision, that the decision lines are going to be. And I should well understand it by the time I get down to the final decision. I understand the findings of fact, I understand the weight given to those, I understand the conclusions of law, I understand where they came from, how they were reasoned out, and why. And that leads inevitably to this decision, and sure enough, there's the decision, and that's clear, and I understand it. Very important that you have that, what I call internal consistency within the document, within the decision. And conclusions, just as we said, they need to flow from the findings of fact and be consistent with those findings of fact. So you should be able to read the findings of fact, read the conclusions of law, and then finally say, well, it's inevitable that the decision would be this, and that decision should be consistent. It should be matched. It should match. Need to cover the legal principles applicable under the circumstances of the case and the state relevant provisions. What's all that mean? Well, obviously, you have to set the decision. It has to be based on some legal principles. Those principles have to be relevant to the circumstances of the case, and there has to be support from state statutes, rule, the agency's policies and procedures. In other words, there's that internal consistency that we talked about before. You should be able to follow the building of this house and say, yeah, that fits with kind of standard practices, and that fits with state law, and that fits with federal law, and that fits with the findings of facts, and that fits with the conclusions of law. And sure enough, here should be the decision. And yes, there it is. There's the decision, and it's consistent with all of those things. Again, you want to build a house that has that internal consistency all through. And again, there's the need to be consistent with each other. If you have sections that have some inconsistencies in it, the onus is upon you as the hearing officer to explain clearly how that inconsistency was resolved. And that needs to be consistent with state and federal law, policy, procedure, and all the administrative statutes. So again, you want to remember when, just as though you were, you got to the building site and you're building a house and you want to build the foundation, you want that foundation to be true, consistent, level, all of those things. When you build the sill plate, when you start to talk about the findings of facts and you start to build the walls, you want those to be true and straight and consistent. You don't want them to be at weird angles that people don't understand. As you build the conclusions of law and you sort of put the roof on the house, you want that to be straight and consistent. You don't want people wondering whether the house is going to stand up. You want it to be consistent with, wow, that looks really solid, and I can see exactly how that house was put together. And then finally, when you put the final decision together, the paint, the doors, the windows, you want people to be able to understand, great, that's how I get into the front door. And it should be really clear. And so you want to build that internal consistency within your decision. So as we move on in our decision, important to remember it needs to be based on only evidence that was submitted within the hearing. The hearing space is the only space in which evidence that can be pointed to in the decision is able to be presented. If it happened outside the hearing, it's not appropriate to refer to in the decision. The hearing space is the one space in which, if you will, going to go back to our house analogy, all the lumber that is being used in the house, all the building materials, all the fasteners, all of that is on display. And there needs to be transparency there. And so it's important that we not bring in anything from outside that space into our decision because it's not appropriate, right? It's not part of the fully transparent process that the hearing should be. Similarly, we have to explain if there's a contrary issue, if there's an issue, as we mentioned over a couple of different slides, if you have some inconsistencies in your finding of fact or your conclusions of law, let's say that one side or another has submitted a legal brief and you rejected that legal brief for a reason. You need to explain that in the decision process. If somebody presented something as a finding of fact and your findings of fact are contrary to that, you need to refer and explain to that. That's a crucial part of the transparency of the hearing process. As either party, I should be able to go through that hearing decision and understand clearly how and why it was made. And if I presented evidence that was not accepted or not or was contrary to the decision, I need to understand why. The decision should only address issues established by the parties. Again, we've said that consistently. That's part of defining what that house is going to be. You wouldn't want to go into building a house and midway through decide to build a different house. It'd be a mess. You want to make sure that you're clear that the issues that are defined by the parties are the ones that are and the only ones that are referred to in your decision. And then finally, a clear statement of actions to be taken to implement the decision. It's part of a best practice that we've learned over time. It's sometimes you put so much work into putting the decision out there that sometimes the temptation is to become less clear about how that is to be carried out to implement the decision. So clear and concise steps, concrete steps that both parties can take to implement the decision are appropriate and important. Here's some steps to consider while you're drafting the decision. You start at the foundation. Identify the issues. That's the foundation of your house. You wouldn't build a house starting with the roof, right? Of course not. You build a house starting with the foundation. So you start by identifying the issues. You list the material facts. Again, that's part of organizing everything together, listing all the material facts, and moving on from there. And at the top of that should be the issues as defined by the parties. Do any research needed to properly apply the law, regulations, agency rules, and policies cited by parties and facts of the case. Again, that's why we suggest as a best practice, request the policy and procedure. As soon as you get the case, request the policy and procedure manual in effect at the time at issue. That way you'll have the agency policy and procedure locked up. You can begin to do a little bit of gathering of let's say the case surrounds eligibility, for example. You can begin to gather some of that data. You don't want to do too much research before all the facts are in, certainly. But if you have all the facts and you have everything together, you can begin to do the research that you need specific to the case, and that's why it's important that you have it all together. And then outline your decision. It's an important kind of first step to say, is this well organized? Is this well presented? It may be clear as a bell in your head, and that can happen, right? When we're when we're deep in the woods and we're thinking about something, boy, it can be super clear to us in our head. But as we present it, sometimes it's nice to see on black and white, oh, wait, there's a real gap here. I didn't explain the middle of this thing, right? Or I took a big leap here. I took a bit of an assumptive leap. I need to make sure that I include some findings of facts here. Or I need to be sure that I'm clearer about my conclusions of law here. So your outline will help with that. So along those same lines, do a draft of your decision when you have it. Make sure that it's readable, that it's clear. Along those same lines, think about the parties that are going to read this decision. If you've got a client, for example, whose reading level is at, say a 7th or 8th grade level, that decision needs to be written at that level. And by the way, there in many word processing programs like Microsoft Word, you can ask Word to tell you what the reading level of your decision is. In general, as a guideline, no decision should be written past an 8th grade reading level. That's the level at which, at least in the United States, most people can read. But if you've got somebody who may be challenged at that level, you need to consider that and write to a level that all parties can understand, be brief, and be clear. Compare your draft to your outline. That way you can say, oh, wow, I missed a piece here. I wasn't being as clear as I need to be. I need to go back to that. And then go back and do final edits. Also important, if you've got someone who can review that for you, and you can do that in a confidential and appropriate manner, please do, because a lot of times when we write something, we read and our brains put in what we left out just by default, and they take out some things we may have put in. So a lot of times a good proofreader can really help up the quality of your final decisions. And here's the checklist, right? So as you're going through your final draft, does it describe the information on which it is based, right? Does it fully describe the findings of law, the conclusions of law? Does it fully explore and identify the issues at hand? Does it address the key elements of the decision? Does it address all the issues? Is the decision supported? Again, here's that piece, right? We should be able to go through the findings of fact, the conclusion of law, and then say to ourselves, oh, and the decision has to be, and that should be what the decision is, right? Is the decision supported by the conclusions of law and finding of fact? Very important piece. And remember, if there's any inconsistencies in there or any evidence that is contrary to those, the onus is upon us to explain why that was considered and why that was not accepted, why that was rejected. And finally, the last steps in your checklist here: does it comply with the requirements of your contract with the agency? Make sure that what your deliverable as defined in your contract is what you're delivering here. Are there pieces have you covered all the pieces that you were supposed to cover? Is it written in a manner that all parties will understand it? Kind of going back to that reading level thing. Is it clear? Is it concise? Is it simple? Did we avoid jargon? Did we avoid lots of acronyms? Again, part of the delivering a product in this case is to make sure that it's usable and understandable. And is it written in a logical and organized manner? Very important pieces. Remember that this is a decision that people will need to use and on which they're going to base their actions. So for that reason, it needs to be clear and concise. In other words, you're presenting this house, people need to understand, okay, great, yes, that's the foundation, those are the walls, that's the roof, I understand how that was all put together. There's the doors and the windows. I understand how the decision was made. I understand how to use the house. I understand how to get in. I understand how it'll work, and I understand my responsibilities with regard to that. So, again, a series of best practices about writing the decision. Best of luck to you in moving forward. We welcome any of your feedback. Our contact information will be available at the end of these training materials. Please feel free to give us feedback. We like to keep this as a living and working document and be informed by your experience as well. So thanks so much for tuning in. We appreciate it. Best of luck in your independent hearing officer activity.